Alright, hi and welcome back. This is the second video for the Intro to 3D Modeling class. And if you haven't already done so, I'd highly recommend checking out the first video, the 3D Modeling Lesson 1 using Maya 2018. It just goes through some of the real basic things that we won't be talking about here anymore, like how to move through the environment, selecting and unselecting things, going into component mode, things that you should really be comfortable with by now. So as always, when we're about to start a new project, we always want to create a new Maya project. So I'm going to come over to File. We're going to come down to where it says Project Window so I can create a new project. And we're going to make sure that it's inside of the right location, which it is. It's facing the old file, so I'm just going to copy that entire thing. So I'm using the same naming convention. And then I'm just going to call it O2. So it's in the right location, it's got a new name, and just like last time when I hit accept, now I know that this project is not just made, but it's also set to the right location. And there it is, and inside here you can see that we have all of my different files. Now again, I haven't actually started making anything, so before I do anything else, I'm just going to go File, Save Scene As, and give it a name. And I'm just going to call this my last name, 3D Modeling 02. And we'll hit Save. Now I know that the file is correctly saved. You can see here the feedback has said, now you have this file officially. And now it's start. Okay, so I have my project ready. And I want to start diving into 3D because I'm super excited and I have this wonderful idea that's floating around in my head, and then I suddenly realized that that would be a terrible, terrible idea. It's so important to first create some kind of a plan to get your ideas down so that you can really see them, and because otherwise they're just electrical shocks running through your brain and you can convince yourself of anything. And one of the things that you can convince yourself of is that your design is fantastic even though you've never actually seen it. So what I've done is I have created inside of Photoshop a simple layout for a space that I thought would be something nice to build. And you can see that there's stairs going up to a second floor. Maybe this is some sort of a meditation area or a yoga space. There's some couches and lots of bookshelves. And then this is a little atrium area where maybe we had a little Zen garden. And as I was building this, I thought, yeah, this is something that would be nice to make. And then I remembered, it's not like I'm paying for this. I'm not buying this. I'm not building this for real. I'm building it to be impressive as a 3D artist. And so as you can see, that was my first idea, and this is my second idea. And as you can see, it's gotten a little bit more complicated here. We have an Olympic-sized swimming pool with 2 hot tubs. I have columns all around my space. Look, I still have my Zen garden though. I have entryways to and into and out of different areas. And then instead of just a simple space for yoga, I've decided to turn this entire area into a ballroom. So this could be used for parties or dancing or yoga or anything else that I wanted. This is the space that I'm going to make. Now, as you can see, these lines here, this area is actually going to be specifically for a set of stairs. So this is going to be multiple levels as well. So this is what we're going to make. Now, because I've already created the Maya project, I know exactly where I need to keep this. Now, it's important to remember that while I don't want to use a Maya Photoshop file in Maya because it's too big and just takes too much effort on the computer, I don't want to get rid of all my ideas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to save this, and I'll go over to the lectures, and I'm going to put it inside of my source images folder. Now because this is a Photoshop file, I'm going to save it first as a Photoshop file, and I'm going to just call this Brainstorm Ideas. Okay, now I have my work saved, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this again. but this time I'm going to save it as a simple JPEG so that it makes this image just the way I want. And this is going to be my layout for my room. Okay? Alright, so now that I have my idea, I can shrink down or close out Photoshop because I'm pretty much done with that. And now it's time to start working inside of Maya. Now, I'm going to use my spacebar tap and come over to my top view, okay? And you can see that right now there's nothing in my scene, but what I want is I want this image to be visible inside of this top view so that as I start working, I always have something to go by, a guide. You see, when I was doing this design, I was already being creative. I was already deciding what I wanted and where I wanted it and what it was going to look like. Now that those ideas and those decisions are finished, I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel back inside of Maya. Maya already has enough to keep track of. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to input an image and have it projected inside of this camera. It's going to actually be stuck on this camera. So if you look right here, there's this little image of, it looks like two pieces of paper. One of them is sitting tall and the other one's sitting flat. Well, what that is, if I click on it, is it allows me to go and choose an image and it becomes part of that camera view. Now if I look at it from another view, you can even see that it's sitting right there on that 0 line. The really nice thing about this is I can even scale it. Remember, what's scale? It's the R key. So I can size it to be anything that I want. Now it's important to remember that at this phase of using 3D, size is really relative. Okay? The only reason that something looks big or small is because you're either close to it or you're further away from it, or something else is bigger or smaller next to it. There will come a time when you can start to really measure things and start to deal with real space. But at this point, since we're just practicing and we're really starting to learn the concepts behind just using the tools, we don't need to go into that kind of scale. So what I would recommend is just make it, you know, a decent size relative to this little perspective square, this grid here. Okay? All right. Now, we have a couple of different options here. When we have this image that is attached to the top camera, if I choose this little button right here, notice that I have actually selected the top camera. Of course, I could do it from over here too. But if this is not visible, then I can always just click on that first little camera icon. And by the way, every one of these windows has one. So if I click on this one, I'll go into Control A. You'll see that I still have top selected. If I select this one, now I have the perspective camera selected. All right, so I can make selections just by clicking on these icons, and I can also just highlight onto that image itself, and I get the image plane information right here. Now, this is where we can specify some of those options, because right now, notice that that object is actually in this view. We can't see it because we're looking at it flat. We're looking at it like that. But it's still in my view. And because I can select it, it could potentially get in my way. Now, because this is only a top view anyway, I really do have the option, and I can do this if I choose, underneath Display, to choose Look Through only the camera that it's attached to. And notice that it disappeared from all the other views. Okay? Now, if you really like the idea that that map is sitting in your world, that's okay too. What we can also do is we can, and by the way, I just went back to the channel box. Notice down here, we have this little set of display options. With this object selected, I'm going to choose this last button, and this last button says that anything that I have selected, I'm going to create a new layer, just like in Photoshop, and I can either lock that layer so that it's no longer selectable, that way it's not going to get in my way. I can also change the way that we see it. So let me just click on that button, and there it is. Now, right now, the layer is called Layer 1. That doesn't really help us very much, so I'm just going to double click, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to choose my layout, REF, for reference. Now, notice right here it says that the display type is normal. If I drop this open, I can change it to template, or I can change it to reference. Now, I'll keep it with template for right now, but when I hit save, you'll see that doesn't help us very much, because template only goes around edges and kind of shows you what the shape of the object is. But what do we need? We need to see it. Now, I can always double click on this layer again, and I can choose reference. Now when I hit save this time, notice that it is in fact visible. But look at this, no matter how hard I try, I can't accidentally select this. So this might be something really useful to use for this. Also, just so you know, if I don't want to see this, maybe I'm working on something and I just need to get this out of my way, I can come over here to this V and just turn it off. Notice that it disappeared. It's not gone. I didn't delete it. It's still in this layer. It's just visibility is turned off. So I turn it on. And then over here, this is the reference. This is the R that I chose. So I said it was referenced. If I click it again, notice there's nothing in there. That means it's normal again. If I click it one more time, it means it's template again. If I click it one more time, it's a reference. So it just cycles through all three of those. Okay, so there's always more than one way of doing something. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to start by breaking down this scene into a very simple layout. Now, before I do that, I'm actually just going to do something that's been annoying me. If I move this up ever so slightly, see how all of a sudden it's now sitting on top of the grid? You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I'm just doing it to make my life a little cleaner so you can see it easier. Okay? Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want to create this entire space. It doesn't have to be this way, but I am going to show you a new tool, and so this is a good opportunity to use that. Okay? Now, again, there's always more than one way of doing something inside of Maya. If I wanted to, I could take a polygon primitive like a cube, and I could simply scale this until it takes up the whole space, and then I can use my points and move my points into space. And if I go into wireframe, look at that. I can see the wireframe of my shape, but because this image isn't really an object in my scene, it's part of the camera, that it's doing a lot of this work for me. I can still see my scene. And then I can start, dividing this up and chopping it. And that's perfectly fine. You're more than welcome to do that. However, I just deleted that. I'm going to use a curve instead. So inside of the curve tools, we have a lot of different ones. Now, there's different reasons for using each one, but I do want to point this out. Notice how the C is a curve and the E is sharp-edged. That's usually how I like to think about this. So I'm just going to tear this option off so we can see what's going on here, and I'm going to slide over to the side so you can see what I'm doing. So with the C tool, remember I'm looking at this from the top view. As I click around, as soon as I start to make enough points, what I get for my effort is a very curved shape. Now if I hit enter, that means that the curve that I've made is finished. Okay? Now I'll hit delete. And then, same thing with the EP curve tool. As I start to create, notice that this also starts to create very, very curved shapes. Again, I'll hit enter, but then I'm going to delete it. Now, because we have different reasons for using curves for different shapes that we're trying to create, I usually like to do this just as a standard. Inside of the option box for the EP, since the letter E is already sharp, I'm going to change this from the curve degree being cubic to linear, and watch what happens when I do that. So with the curve tool now, as I start to make this shape, notice that it's not trying to automatically curve for me. This way, I can start to create any shape that I need to, knowing that I'm going to have some sharp edges. Now, obviously, if you're working on someone else's computer, you're in a computer lab or something, these options aren't going to always be on. But if you're doing this with your own computer, these options are going to remember that that's what you wanted to do. That way, every single time you go to make a shape, you can look at the curve tool and say, did I want one that was curved or did I want one that was sharp? And because these two tools are already remembering how I did it, sharp tools will give me a sharp shape. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, once again, turn the layout reference off so that I can select it. I'm going to go into the attributes and watch this. Underneath the alpha gain option, what I can do is I can bring this down, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to see the grid and the objects at the same time. I'm actually making this semi-transparent. And depending on your image, you can choose however much you feel is necessary. And so this way, I'm going to be able to start modeling using the grid to make my curve. So I'm going to go Control A again to turn that back into a reference. Grab my EP curve tool set to linear, and I'm going to simply hold down the X key. Okay, now holding down the X key when I do this allows me to snap directly to a grid point. Does everybody see how that's happening? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start over there, hold down X, and click the next one. Follow this over, click the nearest grid line, again and again, and I'm just going to start building this outer shell. And if you need to make fewer or more curve lines than I do, that's okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm not actually going to connect at the exact same point. I'm going to go one less because I want you guys to see what happens over here. Okay. Now, I'm going to hide my image so I can now look at the curve itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my curve options, and there's this really great option that simply says that I can open or close a curve. And when I do that, look at that, the curve is now connected. So that means that the whole thing is now one solid loop. So back inside of object mode, I can pull back, and there it is. There's my entire shape. Now, if we look at it from the perspective view, we can see that this curve does go all the way around, and if I turn on my my map again, we can see that it is the correct shape. So again, there's always more than one way of doing something, but if we know that the bottom and the top are essentially going to be the same, what I can do is duplicate this curve and then simply drag it up. Now what I'm creating is a span between these two. Okay, so I have to select both of these, then I can come up into my surfaces options, and I'm going to choose this option called Loft. Now, if I come over into my options, you'll see that by default, the Loft option, because these are curves, are set to NURBS. And what does a NURBS shape mean? Well, it means that it is a shape that was originally made by curves. But notice that in Maya 2018, and many other versions have this too, there is a polygons option. So instead of making NURBS, I can simply make polygons. Now, when I do that, this additional set of options opens up. And there's a couple of things that we definitely want to make sure of. First, inside of the type, we do not want triangles. We're going to choose quads. Quad simply means 4, so that means that all of the polygons will be 4-sided polygons. It's going to make our lives a lot easier. Now, this is just a general rule. I do this all the time. Whenever I'm using curves to make a polygon, I'll always stick to the general option, and you'll notice that when I do that, even more options open up. But the nice thing about using the general option is I can always change inside of the history to make the shape that I'm trying to create. And you'll see that as we go. So with those options turned on, I'm going to hit Loft, and there it is. There's my entire shape. Okay? Now, you might notice that inside is a dark color and outside is a light color. Why exactly is that happening? Well, first off, inside of the lighting options, notice that this says it does not use two-sided lighting. What it's trying to tell you is Maya is trying to tell you that this is the inside of my object. So let's just look at this. If I create a cube, notice that none of those sides have that color, but watch this. If I simply delete one of these faces, oh, the inside is black. So the inside is the inside. And the only reason that Maya does this is because it has to understand which way is facing one direction and which way is facing the other direction. It'll make a lot more sense later, but for now, it's very easy to avoid seeing that. You just come over to lighting and choose two-sided. Now you can see that we see both sides. Okay? Now, there's something else that's happening, and that's this shadowy area. And the shadowy area, it's a little bit more advanced, but I'm going to show you the simplest way to solve this. So depending on how you've created an object, sometimes polygon objects, the edges, that's these right here, sometimes they don't quite know how they want to show how light would cascade over them. And the easiest solution for this is to come underneath the mesh display, if you ever see this, and just choose the soften harden edge option. And you'll notice that there's this number, it's set to 30, but 48 is kind of the magic number. And you can see that now these surfaces are looking correct. Okay? Now, you can also, if you wanted to, harden all of the edges, and that just means that each one of the edges will not let light sort of softly go to the next one. That's really all we're going to talk about as far as that goes. That's just to make sure that the shape that you're making looks as nice as possible. Okay? So now that we have our walls, the next thing that we need is some kind of a roof and some kind of a floor. Now for my design, I actually have multiple levels of a floor. This piece needs to be lower than this piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set this up right now by raising the entire thing up a little bit. And you can see that as I do that, these curves are in the way. And I also want to show you this. When I select the curves, do you see how this object turns pink? Do you remember from the last lesson we were talking about how things have history? And the construction history is sometimes very, very useful. But once you're happy with the way that it turned out, what you need to do is you need to get rid of all this history. So with it selected, I'm just going to come over to Edit, Delete by Type, and choose Delete History. Now I can select those curves, and I can simply delete them. Now, if I'm unsure as to whether or not I'm done with them, I could always put it inside of another layer and just turn it off. That way I haven't really gotten rid of them. But that's entirely up to you, okay? So by raising this up a little bit, now I have some space to work with, and I'm going to choose the part of the room that needs to go down. So notice I've only selected the edges that I need to go down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude them. You might remember that from our class, but what I can do is simply hit Control-E, and notice that I have now this controller that as I start to drag down, I've created more polygons just for where I had selected. Okay? So this is going to help me out when I'm starting to create my floor, because now I can see where part of my floor is and I can see where the other part of my floor is. Okay? Now it's not entirely guaranteed that your scene is going to be as complex as mine, and that's perfectly okay. I'm only doing these extra steps so that you guys can see if this is something that you want to pursue, if you want to try to make it kind of impressive or, you know, fancy, that this is just what you do. You just push and pull points until you get what you want, and then as you continue, you just add more detail, and we see where it goes from there. Alright, so now let's start by creating the roof. So I'll bring this up to where it meets, and then I'm going to once again use that same option inside of the surfaces. So I'll be making a planar, and because I know that the settings worked just fine, I'll use that. And what I may need to do is I can always choose the history of this with the U and the V number, and if I use my middle mouse button and I drag, notice how I can increase the number of faces. Now this can sometimes help a lot if you're trying to refine something, but notice how it's not really paying attention to the shape that I've created. So in this case, I'd probably say that it's not going to be all that helpful. So that's okay. We're just going to come back to our base, and now I'm going to use my modeling toolkit. I'm going to use my multi-cut tool again so that I can start to create those faces that I need. And notice that when I clicked on the first, I went all the way through and it recognized that it would need to make a new vertex point for each one of these, so I can hit enter. Okay. Now, if I go inside my room, you can see that the ballroom is here and the swimming pool is here. Well, I'm the kind of person that if I'm going to have an indoor swimming pool, I'm just going to go ahead and say, you know what, I also want a skylight and I want it angled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the faces that make up the pool area, and I'm going to extrude that, and I'm going to pull it upward. Then I'm going to grab these faces and I'm going to pull it down so that I get an angled skylight. Now the rest of the scene, the rest of my environment, can stay exactly like this, or if I wanted to, I could make it just as fancy, just in a different way. Let me just show you something that's really helpful if you're having trouble getting this to be lined up perfectly. So, if I hold down the D key, notice that I can move this little icon right here. This is actually the center point. Notice that originally the move was over here, but now it's over here where I put it. If I hold down the D key and hold down the V key, what I can do is I can snap, using the middle mouse button, snap it right to one of these points. So now that it is exactly in that corner, I'm going to hold down V again, and I'm going to snap it to the closest point, and look at that. Now it matches perfectly. Okay, so that's a nice little trick there. So from inside the room, we can see that we have this really great skylight now over where my pool is. I'm going to still have to create the stairs, create the columns, create any windows, any additional barriers. But now it's starting to become a little problem because I can't see inside. Well, that's what the layers are for. I'm going to grab the roof, I'm going to add it to a layer, and look at this, I can just turn it on and off whenever I need to. So, if I just come over here, I can highlight it and just call this the roof. And I'm also going to go into my attributes, and notice that when it takes me to the attributes, this one has quite a few of them because it still has a lot of that history. Select the object, edit, and delete history. And now we have fewer of them, but notice right here in this tab, there's this one called Render Stats. What's really great about the Render Stats is the Render Stats don't just tell you how the object will or will not render, but you can also turn off the option for double-sided. Now it doesn't look like anything happened yet because I need to make it the opposite side. Look at that. Now if I look into it, it's completely clear, but if I'm inside, now it looks like a solid shape. Video games do this all the time. If you've ever been playing a game and you get way too close to a wall, sometimes the camera pokes through and it looks kind of like this. That's what you're seeing. Now, since this object is still part of the scene, I can now make it a referenced object, and now if I need to see it, I can, and if I don't, I can simply turn it off. Or I can even turn it to a template, which allows me to just see the wireframe. So, all of these different options, they're all here for your benefit. One of them isn't better than the other. It really all depends on how you work best. Now, I'll eventually need to do the same thing with the floor, but for right now, because I can still see through it, I think I'm going to set up where I want my columns to be. Now, columns, as I'm sure everybody's aware, start out as a cylinder. So what would be the easiest way to start building a column? Well, probably by grabbing a polygon cylinder. So I'm going to enlarge it so that it takes up the right space. Well, that was pretty good. And then I'm going to scale it. And because this one is actually going to start on the one layer and end on the other, I'm going to make sure that it's going through the stairs and it goes all the way up into the skylight. So we're going to bring this up. Now, looking at this, I'm going to grab those faces, bring it up, and then I'm going to grab the faces of the bottom, And then I'm going to choose, once again, Control E to extrude. And you can see that as I start to pull it out, you can see those extra faces. But what I'm going to do first, I'm going to grab one of these scale tools so that the middle scale appears, and I'm going to scale it outward. Okay? So once I have it like that, I hit G to do it again, and then I can come down. And this is really your own personal choice. How do you want your columns to look? How decorative do you want them? How much excess detail do you want? This is entirely up to you. So I'm just going to make a few minor adjustments just by extruding multiple times. And you could, like I said, you can make this as detailed as you would like. All right, there we go. Now, if I come back to object mode, you can see that all of those extrusions are present and accounted for, and my history book is getting long. So I'm going to come over to Edit, and I'm going to delete my history. Now, if you're not happy with what you've created, that's okay. You can always redo it. You can change it. You can grab the faces. You can make things different. It's entirely up to you. But remember, what we're really looking for is just, that wow factor, something that can be both impressive and just something that you can be proud of. So I'll just slide this over, trying to decide if I like it more up against the wall. I think I do. So maybe from the original design, it just needs to be off a little bit. So I'm going to duplicate that object and slide it over to the other side. And I will put that also right against that wall. Okay, there we go. And then from here, I can duplicate it. And notice that these columns are a little bit smaller, so I'm going to have to scale them down. And in scaling them down, it's depending on how I make the ceiling, this might not be tall enough, but for right now it is. So I'll just go ahead and continue on. And remember, if there's more details that you want to add to your column, well, or anything else that you're going to make more of, make sure that you're finished with it before you start duplicating it. Otherwise, you'll have to either delete them all and then reduplicate them, or you'll have to just change them all. You wouldn't want to do that. All right, there we go. So all of the columns over here are more for decoration purposes. So they're much smaller, they're thinner. So I'm going to make sure that I scale them down and bring them over. There we go. And then I'll make sure that they are the right size. And because I scaled them so small, you can see they're definitely not. So I'm just going to put them against the ground here. Then I can just go and grab my vertex points and pull them up. So now that these objects are all called columns and I still have them selected, I'm going to group it all, and then I can call this column GRP to let me know that it's a group of columns. So in my original design, I had one here, but that's kind of in the middle of the space. And what I may end up doing is when I create the wall that comes across here, I may find the exact middle so that I can sort of split that in two. And this is just me, sort of thinking as I go. But I think I might need to just bring that over a little bit. My original design didn't take into account that this was going to be an exterior walkway, almost like an outside garden. So I might just bring that in a little bit. So it's okay to make minor adjustments because as you start to see the world in 3D, it starts to take on a different set of rules. So all of the ones that are up here need to be raised just a little bit. There we go. All right. So I've made good progress. Definitely don't want to forget any of that, so I'll hit Control S to save. And I know that this particular session of Maya knows that I wanted to have saving in incrementals, so that should be fine. So there's a few other pieces that I definitely want to make sure that I name. For example, the main wall. This would be the floor. And then this would be the ceiling. Now, I'm going to get the ceiling back to a normal object because what I want to do is I want to create some skylights. Now, the edges that we have right now, they're pretty close to being what I want, but this one over here is just too small. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this ring, this set of edges, and I selected the entire thing simply by double-clicking on it, and it ran all the way around. Now, if I were to just delete that, with it selected, I just hit delete, something bad is going to happen. Do you notice how all the vertex points are still here? That becomes a major problem. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to make sure that I have the whole thing selected again. And underneath our mesh option, or excuse me, edit mesh options, there is a set that says don't just delete the edge, but delete the vertex too. So when I do that, notice that when I try to go over to my vertexes, those points have also disappeared. This is very helpful for me because now I can make a new set of vertex points where I need them to be. So I'll come back over to object mode, go back over to my modeling toolkit, and I'm going to use my multi-cut tool again. But instead of actually clicking, watch this, if I start outside of it, I can just sort of eyeball this and I'll say, you know what, I think about here would be good. I'm just going to hold down the click and drag button, and when I let go, look at that, it has already created, like a laser beam, has already cut all the way through this. Now, because I have that, I can now just sort of minor shift adjust some things so that I can get an even distribution for those faces. So now that I have them, I'm going to select each one of these. And just like how I created the swimming pool, I'm going to extrude, but there's a trick to this. When I create an extrusion, by default, anything that I do, all of them are going to work together. But notice right here, this little window pops up and it says, do you want to keep the faces together, yes or no? So when it's on, it would be working like you just saw. But when it's off, watch this. When I scale it, it actually splits up and each individual face becomes a new thing. So I'm going to hit G to do it again, and I can extrude up. And so from below, look at this. Now I already have the rafters and the glass. And so now that I have those windows, it becomes a bit more obvious that I needed to adjust the exact locations just to even the entire thing out. But now we definitely have that going. There we go. So select over everything, edit, delete history, and now we are good to continue on. Now I'm going to stop here because instead of watching me work, it's time to let you work. Keep in mind that using those cut tools will make your life tremendously easy. So just continue working and make sure that you follow your own guide, because remember, that was your own idea string, that was your own brainstorming, that's your own creativity, and you definitely don't want to forget any of that. So hopefully this has really helped you out, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and good luck and have fun.